We've now wired up our Google Auth component to print out whether or not the user is currently OAuth'd through our application. But the only issue here is that if we attempt to sign in or sign out on the fly, like while the user is visiting the application, the text does not update. So in this video, I want to figure out how to fix that. The first thing I want to show you is another method that is tucked or kind of hidden away on that auth object. So at my console, I'm going to reference gapi.auth2.getAuthInstance. Now just a moment ago, in the last video, you had seen that we got reference to this.auth.isSignedIn, and then we called .get to figure out whether or not the user is actually signed in. So let's try running that again over at our console. So I can do .isSignedIn and then get, like so. In this case, I am signed in, so I see true right here. Now I want to inspect this isSignedIn object here a little bit more closely. We could reference the documentation to figure out what different methods are available on this isSignedIn property right here, but this is actually a pretty good learning opportunity for JavaScript in general. So I want to show you something kind of interesting about this object. Okay, so I'm going to do gapi auth2 get auth instance dot is signed in by itself without any parentheses or anything like that. So when I reference that object, I see a printup of an object right here, and just as before, I see a couple of very mysteriously named properties on it. So again, these are private functions that you and I are not supposed to call. But very interestingly, and this is the kind of JavaScript interesting part here, you'll notice that there appears to not be any get function assigned to this object. But just 2 seconds ago, we were able to call some get function. So where is that function actually defined? Well, if you've ever been curious, I'm sure anytime that you console log an object inside of your browser, you've always seen this __ proto property right here. And I'm sure you've always been kind of curious what the heck that thing was. So this is a little bit behind the scenes stuff. Essentially, this __ proto reference right there is a reference to this object's prototype property. Now, if you study JavaScript in depth, you will know that prototypes are how JavaScript does inheritance between different so-called classes. Because remember, in JavaScript, we don't actually have classes. Instead, we have prototypes. Internally, this GAPI library uses inheritance all over the place for assembling all these different functions that we're making use of and all these different objects that we're making use of. So the actual get function that we care about right there is actually available through the prototype of this object. And again, this __ proto property is a reference to the prototype of this object. So if I expand this, you're going to see that the get function that we just called is actually tucked away on the prototype of the isSignedIn object. Now again, that was just a little kind of interesting thing I thought you might be interested in. More relevant to the problem at hand and figuring out how to update our header up here text anytime that the user signs in or signs out, you'll notice that there's also a method on this prototype called listen. So this is a method that we can pass a callback function to. If we pass a callback function to listen, it will be invoked anytime the user's authentication status is changed. And so we can pass a callback to that thing, and then maybe call setState or something like that inside there, and then we could somehow update the text inside the header anytime the user signs in or signs out. So let's try wiring that up right now. Back inside my code editor, I'm going to find the component didMount lifecycle method. Here's the .then statement where we initially set our state with the current value of isSignedIn. So immediately after that, I'm going to set up a little event listener. So I'll say get a reference to that auth object .isSignedIn, and then I will call the listen function that we just spoke about. And to this thing, I'm going to pass a callback function. I'm going to call it this.onAuthChange. So we don't have a function with that name or a method on this class just yet, so I'm going to add it as an additional method underneath the component didMount. So right here I'll say onAuthChange. And because this is a callback function, I'm going to set it up as a arrow function so that its context is bound to my component. So then inside of here, this function right here is going to be called anytime the user's authentication status changes. So inside of here, we're probably going to want to update our state and update the state with whether or not the user is currently signed in. So inside of here, I'll call this.setState. I'll update the isSignedIn property on my state object. And for the value of that, I'm just going to reach back into the library and get the user's current authentication status, just as we did before with the isSignedIn.get. So I'll say this.auth. Remember, that is our reference to the auth object. .isSignedIn.get, like so. Okay, so that's definitely not bad. So now in theory, if we flip back over to our application, we can do a quick refresh. We're still going to see the text appropriately up here for either we are signed in or we are not. But now, anytime that we sign out or sign in, we should see some updated text right there, even if we do not refresh the page. So I'm going to try manually signing out of my library right now. So I'll say GAPI auth2 get auth instance dot sign out, like so. If you are currently signed out, you could do sign in instead to go through the OAuth process, but we're going to do sign out right now. So I'm going to call sign out, and then you'll notice that the text up here says immediately I am not signed in. And now we can get that to flip back to being signed in by doing a same call, but for sign in instead. So when we do that, we'll go through the OAuth flow again. So I'll select my account, and then I see the text up here automatically update to reflect the fact that I'm now signed in. Perfect. So we now have the ability to update our authentication state on the fly. Now, one little optimization we could do here, you'll notice how inside of the .then statement, we have essentially the same exact line of code that we have down inside of onAuth change. So if we wanted to, we could actually remove this right here and instead call this .onAuth change, like so. That's going to make sure that we get the current authentication status when we first initialize our library and update the authentication state to be whatever its value should be. So if you want to do that refactor, it's fine, but I would recommend you kind of leave it as is for right now, because we're going to eventually come back to this class and do a big refactor to it, or not a big refactor, but a little refactor once we add Redux into our project. So I would recommend you have the two set state calls for right now, even though it's not super ideal. Okay, so this looks great. Now the last thing we have to do is make sure that our render auth button right here doesn't return a simple div, but instead returns an actual auth button that says to the user either, hey, click this to sign in or click this to sign out. So let's take care of that in the next video.